thank you that my new friends that I met just last week, and then I've got a lot of, they're not old, but they're old friends on here that have joined, which I feel joy seeing these familiar faces, and I hope to get to know all of you better, because this is going to be a committed meeting of mine. So, what Bob said, asked me to talk about, and I think probably this is the theme of this meeting, is emotional sobriety. And I'm sure that, there's really nothing new under the sun out, in the program, but I'm sure most of you have read this paper by Bill W. It's called It's on Depression. He wrote it when he was 16 years sober. Now, Bill didn't want to drink again. That was immediately removed from his brain in a flash of light spiritual experience, but he suffered such deep depression and anxiety that he wanted to kill himself at 16 years sober. And that's when he did some of his best work. That's when he wrote the 12 and 12. And so he really, if he was here, he was always ahead of the game. He was always talking about the future. But if Bill was here, he'd be right in this meeting, because what he talked about in this paper was that he had to break every dependence that he had on his wife, on AA, on the material, on the big book, because his good feelings about himself came from outside himself. So he gave us, and he called this paper, talked about emotional sobriety. So I want to tell you a little bit about the struggle, long struggle I had with emotional sobriety, and by the grace of God, I am in good recovery today. Grace of God, people like you, in action on my part. I live in recovery today, but it's been a long journey that actually started in, I grew up in one of those dysfunctional homes, and like a lot of us did, my mother was a prescription drug addict and alcoholic and wore out couches. She was sick all the time and laid on the couch. I became her caretaker about 8, 9 years of age. At age 13, I drove her to a state hospital in Big Springs, Texas. And those of you that have ever heard Clancy, he calls that his alma mater. That's where he went, because he was going through Texas to California, and he got picked up and put in the state hospital there. So we figured out one time that him and my mother were probably there at the same time. But nevertheless, it was not a healthy childhood at all. My father was a violent man. He was sadistic. He sexually abused me until I was 13 years of age. He didn't like women. Particularly anyone that didn't, that had darker skin than he. My mother's part Indian, and I have dark skin, dark hair. He was blue-eyed, brown, blonde hair, white complected, and that's how my sister was. He never really liked me, but he used and abused me, and he always called me Black Baby. He never called me by my name. He called me Black Baby. But anyway, I knew at age 8 that my life was going to be different, and I became a seeker of help, taking myself to a little church behind our house. I did everything to find some kind of help. I would hope today that CPS would go into a home like ours, but there probably wasn't CPS back in those days. People didn't know what was going on in that home. But anyway, I made a decision. I wasn't going to ever marry an alcoholic or become one. And I didn't. I married me 2 of them, and I became one. So don't ever say never, And not only did I become an alcoholic, my primary was and is my eating disorder, the compulsive overeating, and later turned into bulimia that I practiced for 13 years. That bought me a ticket to treatment, but nevertheless, my dad hated fat women, and I think on some conscious or unconscious part in a child's brain, I made a decision to eat. I started overeating at age 4. I weighed 139 pounds in the first grade, and by the time I was 13, I weighed 230, and continued till I weighed up to 287 pounds. So food was my best friend and my worst enemy for years. And that would keep, my mother, I know today, she drank to push the feelings down. Food worked for me to push the feelings down. I was not only addicted to certain foods, but I was also addicted to quantity, to the volume. I had to have a lot of food, not just a little bit, a lot, to keep pushing those feelings down. And so I found Overeaters Anonymous in 1972 and had some success. I found Al-Anon in October of 1968. And there again, I got somewhat healthy, much healthier, but I was still using the food to push the feelings down. So in 72, I found my way to OA, and like I said, I had some success, worked the steps, all of that, but I could never get completely honest about the food. I would never, I would say, this is what I'm going to eat, and then I wouldn't eat that, and then I would add to it. So that kind of program doesn't work, and I lived in dishonesty. And so, we began, I think, as children, we began to pick up our parents' feelings, particularly those that they never worked through. And what I got from my dad was rage, and I became a rager. Not just anger, but rage. Rage goes through the same addiction cycle as any drug because it becomes a drug in our brain for a lot of it. It's like a process addiction. And then I'd look over there at my mother, and my mother felt sorry for herself, and she felt sorry for me, and I felt sorry for her, and I felt sorry for her. So self-pity. Self-pity and rage are two dangerous, dangerous feelings for any addict to have. But that's how I went through my life. And how that would play itself out is someone would do something to me. A grocery clerk, and I was hoping that they would so I could get mad at them. Anything could set me off, but I really saved the worst of it for the people I love the most, and that's my children. And I would, particularly one, I really abused my children inside the home with my rage. And by the grace of God, we're all in recovery, and we can talk about it today. So, but how that plays itself out is, I would get a resentment going, and then those feelings would start up and come up and come up and come up, and then I would blow up. And then I would have that sense of ease and comfort. I felt good because I had gotten it out. Of course, there'd be like bodies laying out there where I'd just blown them away. And then I would, so I would get mad at the other person, and then I would see the harm that I did, and then I would get mad at myself. So I'd have a self-resentment. So not only was I mad at them, but then I'm mad at myself. And then I would get to thinking, yeah, but they started it. If they hadn't done so-and-so, I wouldn't have had to blow up at them. So then that would turn to self-pity. And it's the self-pity that would get me back to the food. The rage was energizing. The self-pity was deadly. It would get me back to any substance that I could put my hands on and any process addiction. And it went on for many years. And but when I would get into the self-pity, which is deadly for any addict, because it's pour me another drink or pour me another milkshake. When we get there, we have to find something to ease that pain. And so that was my life. And although on this other side, I was looking for help, found a lot of help, gradually got a little better, went to, treatment I had to go to, I had the privilege of going to treatment for my eating disorder 37 years ago and have been in good recovery since and maintaining 160-pound weight loss by the grace of God. And then later, because of that, when I came home, when I got into recovery from my eating disorder, oh my God, it created an opening for all of those feelings to come up that I had carried from the trauma of the abuse. And I thought I had worked on it. And I had worked on it to the extent that I could while numbing the pain with food. But it was back big time. So then I went to treatment in Florida for of her trauma program. Then I do a 5-day, a 6-day, a 7-day. I went to trauma 12-step programs. I did everything. It took me 12 years to work through the trauma, and I am complete with it. I can talk about it, what my dad did to me. I can talk about it like news, weather, and in sports. It has no hold on me today. So what happened when I came home from treatment, I started switching addictions, because that's what we do, unless we get to that core pain, unless I got to that core pain and lanced that boil on the inside. So I went, and I can tell you, it was 2 days after I got home from treatment, I went to the mall with a credit card, and I went to buy a pair of shoes, and I started charging and debting and spending, and I did that for 1 year. I could not stop myself. And I wrote up a big bill, and my husband was the sweetest man on the face of the earth, and was a little codependent with me. And, he always made us a good living. And he said, honey, I'll pay that off. And I said, no, you're not. I know it's far more than all those trinkets I've bought. This is another addiction. So I went to Dallas, started going to DA meetings, Debtors Anonymous, and I brought the meeting back here to Abilene. And then we started, ACOA. I'll tell you, when I walked into my first ACOA meeting, that's when I felt the most at home of any 12-step meeting I've ever been in. And I felt at home at all of them. I qualified for just about every one. But when I stepped into an ACOA meeting and I heard the literature and I heard other people talk, the shame of growing up in that home began to leave me. And so I've never just sat on my laurels. I've always been, looking for the next help or whatever. So, but I want to tell you about that I am in recovery for rage. My friends here keeping time. What time am I good?
You got about 5 more minutes.
Okay, I want to tell you my last rage attack. And, God is either everything or he's nothing. He either is or he isn't. And that comes straight out of the big book, not for me. So I have a place of business, and we had built a new building. And I got up and went to work one morning, it was 22 years ago. And I was back when I was still wearing high heels. And so I was walking to work. I lived about a half a block from work. And I was walking to work, and here was these big, and a lot of them, cliche and big rocks that was almost blocking the road that the construction people had left. Well, I went over to the center and asked our executive director if he would get someone to move the rocks. He said, of course, yeah, well. So I went on into the building and I was doing a family week, and it did that. Went home that evening, the rocks were still there, and I thought, oh, well, he'll get them tonight or tomorrow. Second day, same story, rocks still there. Third day, same story, rocks still there. Now, I had a justified reason to be angry, but for addicts of my kind, there's no justification for anger. So when I saw on that third day those rocks were still there, I was training somebody to go over and do what we were doing, and I called her and I said, you go do the morning, I'll come in and do the afternoon. And I went home, came home, changed my clothes, put on some old shorts, and got me a wheelbarrow and a shovel. And I went out there in gloves, and I started picking up those big rocks and shoveling, and I was so angry. And here he came, the executive director. He said, oh, Tenny, I am so sorry. Here, let me have it. And I started cussing him, and I chased him back to the building with that shovel. I'm so grateful I didn't hit him on the back of the head. I went totally insane with my rage. And one by one, the employees would come out, and he'd send them out there trying to get me to stop, and I'd chase them all off. And then here came the fire chief, who was a dear friend of ours. They called him, town of 463 people, everybody pretty well. But he drove up, and in his West Texas accent, he said, well, Tenny, what's going on? And I knew they'd called him. I said, you get back out of here. This is none of your business. I read him off, and he was a dear friend. In a few minutes, my husband drove up. And when he got out, and I want to cry just thinking about it. He got out of the pickup and he came over, took the shovel out of my hand and put his arms around me, and he said, what's going on? And I just started crying. I just started crying and sobbing. And by that time, I could look over at that building and see all those people in our business that were here for us to work with. They were all watching this scene. I mean, I was so embarrassed. I had so much shame. And I uttered just a word, just, God help, God help. And I had a spiritual experience like that, a flash of light spiritual experience. And I have not had to rage since, and that's been 22 years ago. Very seldom do I ever get angry. I can get a little, I don't know if I'm getting older and I just don't notice things. I don't know, but I don't get angry. If I do, get upset about something, we work it out. I have tools to work things out, but I no longer rage. And in the back of, toward the end of Bill's letter, what he realized that dependence on anyone had to be broken at its core. And that dependence that I had on my mother, for one, and then the shame and that trauma from my dad, that was dependence. It's like it became my shield. Well, I'm an incest survivor, and we must say it out loud so we won't forget it. But after that day, I'm no longer a rager. And there's people that I know today that have never seen me rage. But I would rage at my employees, not as bad as I did to my children, but I would rage, and I am not proud of that. I have made amends, but the kind of amends I make today is living amends by not acting the way that I used to act. So the program works if we work it, and thanks, Bob, for asking me to speak. The self-pity is not, I don't live in self-pity. Those two absolutely have been removed from my brain, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And so with that, I'll pass. Thank you.